Hello and welcome to Growing the Edge, the show about transformation. There's only 3 rules, which is dress for radio, don't be boring, and always remember the rule of 3. So today's episode is about red team lies. Now, I'm fairly new to the concept of red teams. I suppose where I've come across it is, so Ben, it was a topic you introduced. I know, Marcus, it's something that you have knowledge of. I've come across it with, there's Morpheus in the Matrix, with that famous scene where you have to choose between the red pill and the blue pill, and there's also red teaming in a cybersecurity context as well. But I believe it's even broader than that.
It is, yeah, absolutely. So obviously, Morpheus beginning curious to take the red pill in the Matrix is without doubt one of the most famous scenes, if you will, from the red pill blue pill scenario. And obviously it's been in the press quite a lot in the US news over the last few months, with Elon Musk forcing everyone to take it. But beyond the cybersecurity, there's also the original aspect of wargaming, where the red teaming came from. So the blue team would be the good guys, and the red team would be the opposition. But then over time, and certainly post 9/11, it's very much moved into the decision support matrix element. So how do you make better decisions faster by thinking differently? And it's that aspect that we've been certainly working on with businesses over the last few years, and certainly what the military and intelligence agencies have evolved since that post 9/11 disastrous event.
So in the Matrix, Marcus, the red pill is about this uncomfortable, slightly disturbing reality that Neo is thrust into. In fact, he awakes, I believe, he finds out he's a battery attached to some big alien battery farm. So it's pretty gross and disturbing. I mean, is this where we go as well with the sort of militaristic? Do we go into the sort of the dark, the terrifying space? Is that what we're talking about?
It's not so much the dark and terrifying, but I guess it's that comfortable truth that you hide behind. The comfortable lie that you hide behind. And do you want to see that uncomfortable truth? And hopefully it's not that we're all wired up and living in bubble vats. But, many organizations don't want to know sort of many of the truths that are bubbling away below the surface. And they find it far more comforting to hide behind and live in this fog of untruth. And that's far more comforting. But as we've seen this year, with 2020 and the COVID pandemic, that's ushered in now a completely new era of unprecedented disruption. So if you want to carry on behaving that way, as you see in the Matrix, take the blue pill, but over time, and very quickly now, that time is going to be reduced. You're going to find yourself in a whole world of pain from a business perspective.
So it's really about the ability to make better decisions and be able to sense make, because I have a better awareness of all of these factors that are going on, even the ones that are maybe inconvenient or uncomfortable.
That's exactly it. It's making sense of where you are. It's understanding where you are. And unless you're honest with yourself, and this is whether, as individuals, as parents, as friends, or whether you're running a business, if you're not honest with yourself and you clearly understand your surroundings and all the ugly truths that stand there as well, then how can you make the best decision possible? Because that thing that you're ignoring will come back and bite you at some point down range. So it's just been open and transparent, and using, these very simple but capable, powerful tools and techniques that allow these things to surface anonymously if you need to do so, if you don't have that psychological safety. But it gives you that true perspective of what's going on to allow you then to move forward with your organization, move the culture in the right direction, and make those decisions as you should at the speed you need them to.
Right. So what we're really talking about then is the need to kind of embrace these things. Now, obviously, the military, they have to do war gaming. I guess that's why presumably it comes from that background. So they have a long history of embracing the truth, because it's a life or death thing, isn't it? And maybe Absolutely. For companies, for a while, it's not so dramatic as that. Is that? So I'm wondering, just like Ben and Dan and Mandy, is how does this then get applied into a domain that's a non-militaristic domain?
Well, I think it's probably worth digging into instances where the military has screwed this up, because the lies that we tell ourselves get worse the higher up an organization that we go. So, you know, the biggest screw ups happen at the strategic level, where you don't realize that you're following the wrong strategy. So, I mean, as an example, you know, our foreign policy is probably littered with examples over the last 20 years of instances. I mean, this, you know, I'm sure Marcus can dig into this in a bit, but red team thinking, as currently practiced by the militaries of the West, was in large part a reaction to the disastrous decision to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think the more complex and the more connected circumstances become, and the more exponential events become, i.e., you know, a small thing happens and the ripple effect happens quicker and quicker, the more important it is to think through the possible consequences of an action, so that you're not caught short, as we have been in, you know, both our foreign policy, but, you know, also business over the last, you know, 10, 15 years is littered with examples of, you know, monumental screw ups that actually weren't that unexpected in hindsight.
And what is it about? What stops us from engaging in these in these sort of wargaming scenarios? I mean, I remember as a consultant, there was this thing like, was it SWOT? We would do like a SWOT matrix or something like that. And but I've noticed there's also a prevalence, you know, of sharing good news and positive thinking and hoping for the best. And I don't know, is that part of a kind of a corporate groupthink type of culture that can kind of get a hold in organizations, and how do we resist it?
I think there's definitely a tendency to in organizations where, you know, the person who feels weaker may not speak up. They may see something as a problem, but because their voice is never heard and they are on the ground, they may even be the lowest paid person, they probably, you know, and they can see quite clearly what the problems are, but their voice is not going to be heard. They're not going to make an impact, so they stay quiet. And as a consequence, you're breeding that sort of a culture where you have a leader in position who is very alpha male, very much strategic thinking, possibly selfish, because he or she wants their bonus, and they are driven by you know, metrics and objectives that are really personal, as opposed to bigger, wider business objectives. And I've definitely seen this in organizations where people can see it, and you hear it, you know, in the car park, in the coffee shop, you hear people saying, it's never going to change. It's never going to change. So, you know, oh, here we go again. Here we go again. And all of these sorts of things, you know, just breed that culture of, you know, we're not empowered to make change happen in a positive way. And that kind of like really is for me, it sort of falls into two buckets. You've got leaders who are just aggressive and really just want to go in one direction. And then you've got the workforce who know that actually this is happening, and that they feel too meek and weak to, you know, to make a difference. And you have consultants coming in and they have to kind of like, you know, be very much impartial and give their opinion. And on day one, they may be asked, oh, what do you think? You know, which way shall we go? And you think, hold on a minute, I've just arrived. Oh, and speaking about who's just arrived, here's Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
Welcome.
Yeah,
Caroline.
we've also got Lou is watching, and he's saying sorry to be late. Was getting my crisps ready. So yeah, we have a long-standing tradition of you know, having crisps on the show being eaten. So but this is I suppose the human condition, isn't it? So there seems to be a stigma around sharing bad news versus sharing good news, and this is, you know, you've got the power of positive thinking. That was a book, wasn't it, that came out. We've got some very famous proponents, as we know, on the world stage of that sort of thing. But I suppose there's that pathology then of you know, if we're thinking of the upside, then we're potentially then you know, prone to these strategic blunders where we're actually not seeing the world as it is.
Yeah, definitely. It's the rose-tinted spectacle view, isn't it, that many wear. I was in one organisation where I spoke, again, going around, as Mandy said, talking to people on the ground saying, how are things here? And someone said, well, do you want me to tell you the truth, or shall I give you the top line? It goes, because they all think it's a Lego movie. I said, what do you mean? He goes, everything is awesome, which is the Lego strapline movie when it came out. And he said, you know, we're just force-fed the hosepipe effect of everything's great, everything's going on track. This new thing we're doing, it's working really well. You know, it's almost the Donald Trump-esque, we are great, we are the best. And they, at the coalface, can see this thing just cracking beneath their feet. And they're trying their best, and they start to voice up and bring their concerns, and they either get beaten down, they get bad reports, they don't get the bonus. So as Mandy said, you know, these people just adopt sheep-like passivity, and you start to therefore breed mediocrity. And once you start to do that, the toxicity in your organization, the breeds like wildfire, and the culture shifts almost instantaneously. And once that's got a hold of you, it's so hard to get that back, and it takes strong leadership. And so many of these new digital agile transformations are all saying, oh, it's bottom-up driven, the teams have the lead, they have the autonomy. No, they don't, right? That's all very well if you don't have the top level support, if you don't have those leaders, and I use that in a loose phrase, you know, if you don't have the executives at the top leading by example, with humility, with empowerment downwards where required, and clarity and purpose, then they're going to sit in a little world of awesomeness at the top, and down at the coalface, you've got absolute bedlam and mayhem and very unhappy people. And one of the biggest things we look at when we go into organizations is, what's your churn rate? How many people are leaving? Because, you know, invariably you either get good people will up and go, they won't stand for it. They'll stand up and try and make a difference and get fired, or they just become sheep. And therefore you get this real awkward balance across the baseline of what your company is actually doing and stands for at the coalface.
And Dan, I'm just wondering how that relates to your experience.
I think that probably every organization experiences this, and it's funny when I think back to my time in the military. The concept of red teaming, in a kind of professional sense, bringing together teams with a process that they follow, and there's doctrine associated with it. It's been born of the military, and yet when I reflect back on my experience of the military, I didn't actually see it used all that much. And recently, I've been trying to sort of figure out why the military, in some respects, can be held up as a bastion of good practice in many areas: agility, adaptability, bringing people together, aligning them. And I think there has to be a differentiation, which is identified here, and that's war fighting versus it being a bureaucratic organization in peacetime, much like any large private organization. And the thing that interests me is, well, what drives the fact that the military can perform during times of war, and yet it suffers the exact same problems as any other large organization during peacetime? I think it comes down to a driver, and I think that driver, as Rory Sutherland, the vice chair of Ogilvy, puts it, is that the major activity, or the primary activity in business, is arse covering, with value generation a small secondary sideline. And I think that career progression, people putting themselves and their own circumstances first, is the root of an awful lot of these problems. The military overcomes that when they put you in harm's way, and all of a sudden your career prospects fall into a small secondary consideration. So it's a fascinating thing. But I mean, for me, it just boils down to being intellectually open and curious. And what red teaming does is it gives leaders the ability to start critiquing their own thinking, which I think is the beginning of that process of instilling curiosity and openness.
So it's really the critiquing in their own thinking. It's also it's raising the prospect of personal weaknesses or personal failures. So I'm assuming that another aspect of this, as well as, Marcus, you mentioning humility, is people being able to talk about weaknesses and failures and presumably biases as well. I mean, this reminds me a little bit of some of the things I've heard about. Was it Alan Mulally when he took over Ford? I think he'd come from Boeing or something like that. And there's this story where he went to the first board meeting and it was a sea of green rag status reports, and he said, I don't believe it. And the next board meeting, it was all a sea of red, and he said, now we can start making progress.
Absolutely. It's that acceptance, isn't it? But that again came from the top, because everybody was fearful, because and bizarre, we had one C-suite member. He said, look, he wanted all this, but even when he was very open with it all, he still wasn't getting it back from his workforce. And he'd put all the right measures in place, everything we'd shown them and taught them. And then when we were allowed to go and speak to them, you then found out that it's like an abused child. They'd been so battered and scarred and bruised by their previous employees. Just because the knight in shining armor came in at the top as a CEO, they didn't trust him. They didn't trust the mechanism, the system that was in place. So it had to be a real slow burn capability that had to come through trust and demonstration by the CEO that this is, I'm not just doing this to trap you all. It's the old Star Wars thing, don't go, it's a trap, because no way would any CEO behave that way. But when they start to see it, then you start the wheels moving and the momentum picks up. But it's not always the top down, it's sometimes the bottom up, but it's always a reflection of the system. And Alan had that when he went in there first. He had exactly that by being open. And the first guy that put his hand up and went, I'm all red, everybody waited with bated breath thinking, right, this is it. This guy's going to get fired. And then Alan said, no, come sit around here. Come sit around the board table next to me and show me. And then you stay there. And then the next week, funny old thing, everybody's red and all the problems start getting resolved. And it's also one of the things when Alan first went in there, Bryce Hoffman, who wrote American Icon, the story of Alan Mulally's journey there, and also the author of Red Teaming. Bryce got into that because Bryce was being written to as a local reporter in the automotive industry by employees of Ford. And when he went in there, Alan sat down and said, right, okay, yes, let's do the book. Let's tell this story. He goes, but Bryce, why are these people writing to you? Why are they doing this? Why are they being so duplicitous and deceitful towards their company? And Bryce was like, Alan, it's because they love Ford. They've tried everything internally to get what they feel open and upwards, and it hasn't got anywhere. So they're writing to me. And now I can come to you with it. Let me tell you this. Once you start behaving in the way I think you will, my lines will dry up. They won't contact me again because they'll have no need. You've created that conduit of transparency and openness that they want. They've been craving for this. And I think that's the big thing that organizations need to realize, that you don't make plans and strategies at the top and tell them at the bottom to deliver them, right? Whoever's involved in the planning execution needs to be involved in the planning of that plan. And if you don't allow that to happen, then things are going to go very bad very quick.
So it's really about following through and leading by example, and showing weakness and the ability to have inner strength and take responsibility. It reminds me a little bit of what I've heard about Satya Nadella taking over Microsoft, whereby there was an instance where he made a remark about, I think it was maybe about women. It was a mistake. It was a faux pas, and he heard about it, and he rather than hushing it up, he did this big announcement. I was wrong. I got this wrong, and here's how I'm going to fix it. And straight away, it shows that, well, actually, he's a person. He makes mistakes. He's able to take responsibility and fix them and move forward. And straight away, that's going to take an enormous amount of pressure off people's shoulders if they're wanting to be authentic. And because obviously it was maybe a bit more of a macho culture before then. People are able to kind of show that they can make mistakes, because they're human, and then move on. So I think it's, to some extent, what we're talking about is understanding that in companies we're humans, we're not robots.
Yeah, and it's that macho culture, I think, that you nailed it there, that has been a sort of rollover from the last century. And what we've seen is all these new ways of working, these technical digital ways of working are great. They're 21st century required. We've moved away from Tayloristic production lines, but we haven't evolved the thinking with it. We're still working in 20th century macho management thinking, which therefore doesn't allow the new ways of working to be as evolved as they are. but they get blamed for, agile's not working in my company. You guys at the coalface don't know what you're doing. But it's not the execution of the tool. It's the way it's been implemented with an old school mindset and still kept hold of with those long reins of risk management and, lack of responsibility being cascaded down. And that's the humanistic shift, I think, that needs to happen. And
also, I think a lot of organizations and leaders are blinded by thinking agile is going to fix everything. And, you go in and you start doing a program or, a project, and they think, oh, right, okay, so we're going to bring this in 6 months early. No, actually, what we're saying is let's start early and fail and understand where the pitfalls are. Let's get cracking with it. Let's not do laborious specifications. Let's say, okay, let's start with a small amount of work that we can prove that it can work. But I think what often happens is organizations take that literally, or organizational leaders take that literally as if, okay, we're going to now produce something within a fraction of the time, and this is going to benefit us, and now we're going to go and sell this, and when we sell this, we are then going to tie ourselves into this red tape of delivering it on this date, and if we don't deliver it on this date, we're going to shoot the people who are trying to deliver it.
Yeah.
So I think there's an awful lot there with regards to agile creating reputation, and people then feeling, oh, let's not even bother with agile, and companies don't even bother. They do the work in an agile fashion, but they don't label it agile.
Correct. I see agile as the straw that's floating past the drowning man in many organizations, and instead of fixing the root cause problems, this thing surfaced as a new way of shiny offering that's going to solve all your problems, and it's sold as such. The snake oil sellers portray it as such with their shiny PDFs. And therefore, these poor executives who know no better, because they're still stuck in that old mindset, but they've seen this new thing in the Harvard Business Review, and we've got to have robots and APIs and machine learning, and this is the solution to that. So they grab onto it quick, and they believe that's a silver bullet, and therefore they're even more desperate for it to work. So it becomes even more rigorous than a waterfall program. Those deadlines have to be met now, because this has to prove, because I've told the board this will be our new panacea, and therefore we start to see the wheels come off.
That's right. We know that is there this thing called a J curve. So it's often with with agility. So funny enough, I know, Marcus, you worked at Lloyd's. There's a guy from Lloyd's talking at a conference last year around agile transformation. But one of the themes there was often things get worse before they get better whenever there's a transformation. In fact, there was a lady there who had done an agile transformation, believe it or not, for a Russian bathroom supplies company, and for the sales team, can you believe? And it made, I think their sales target, they're only hitting something like 42% of their sales targets. She came in to help them do an agile transformation, and within a few months, they're only hitting something like 32% of their targets.
Yeah.
But the CEO who brought her in believed in it and kept with it, and eventually they were hitting something like 124, 130%. But it got worse before it got better, and it's to do with the mindset. And I see this a lot because often the advantages of agility in terms of quicker, fast, basically quicker, cheaper, better, are derived from the mindset change. But because they're a derivative, people can forget that, and they can just focus on quicker, faster, better, rather than it being a product of that mindset shift. And it's a subtle distinction that a lot of people miss out. And that's where I think we get probably the challenges with these scaled agile frameworks, where there seems to be a tension between what's required to actually really go through that mindset transformation and the real politic of trying to align a traditional organization with the way it works with an agile delivery arm.
Yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't mind chipping in here a little bit about agile, having had it inflicted on me more than once. For me, agile is a tool for tactical level delivery, right? It's short term, it's you know, a bite-sized chunk of work that's deliverable by a team that is empowered, and the power to deliver that is within that team. But that's, you know, that's not enough to sense make within an organization. You know, if you've got an organization that's massive and it's got, you know, strategic goals and it's got changing macroeconomic conditions, right, that is not in the realm of agile. So trying to make a scaled agile framework that, you know, looks like a tube map from hell, right, that is not going to provide any kind of value in sense making in an organization ever.
Exactly to your point, Ben. I think that Agile was a project management house adaptation to Prince 2, which is for projects. It's not for whole organisational change. And I think the mistake that organisations have made is that they've gone, right, we've got this new tool. It's meant to make us cheaper, quicker, faster. We'll try and scale that across the organisation. And that's not the reality of what a successful tool does. So apologies for my lateness, everybody. I was the victim of marital team lies this evening. I was, never mind red team lies. My husband told me it was Wednesday. And I was like, no, it's not. It's Thursday. I'm going to do the podcast.
You can't trust
No,
these people.
I'm going to go make some
believe the
noise
lies that you're told.
upstairs. It's Wednesday, and convince me completely, having just got back from a really long day. And so whilst he was busy making noise, I totally missed that it was a Thursday, in fact. And that's how marital team lies works. But moving on from marital team lies, I think it's a really interesting discussion. I used to have a team manager within a team, and he would always say to anyone more senior than himself, it's all going very well. And whilst he did that, he would tap his nose, and that was code for it's going to shit, but you're not going to know about it. And when I asked him why he constantly did that to see what the fear level was in the organisation, he said, you have to remember, Caroline, that the Queen thinks the world smells of paint, and so therefore it does. And that's the reality, isn't it? The reality is that what we're really trying to do is to ensure that our senior leaders are happy. Now, in testament to that, he has seen off many managers of the same position who have been fired for speaking the truth to the power, and in not speaking the truth to the power but keeping your head down and getting the job done, actually you're a preferred member of staff. And I think it's an interesting one that we talk about this openness. And the CEO absolutely can come in and say open doors and mean it. But when you're hemorrhaging costs, when you're not sure what the reality is, what the truth is, when your staff are becoming sick because there are too many different approaches to one project, the reality is at some point you're going to have to buy the lies that you're being told. And I don't think it goes deep enough into the organisation for one CEO to be saying that to the next level down. I think every level then needs to communicate that message, and then they need to create a culture of trust, as Marcus mentioned. But creating that culture of trust can take a long period of time, and you've then got to make sure that people don't intervene with that and create an untrustworthy culture, because that can flip back much quicker. So it's a much deeper and longer term issue than we think.
Changing any culture is incredibly difficult. I remember when I was in a training system for a while, teaching the sort of next generation of military helicopter pilots how to fly, when there was a complete overhaul of the safety culture and actually the safety organizations and structures that supported it. And what they wanted to get to was an open reporting culture where anybody, even on the periphery of involvement within aviation and operating aircraft, would actually hold their hand up if they'd had a near miss, even. So that it's not even holding your hand up because you have just made a mistake or something has happened which you weren't expecting. It's even if you get close, and they created an entire reporting structure, and the way that they referred to that was that it was a just culture. And the impact of people, managers in particular, on the fragility of that culture was huge, because it only takes that one instance where somebody is treated unfairly, when all they were trying to do is put their hand up and be open and honest, and it destroys the entire thing, and it destroys the upward and downward flow of trust, and you have to start from scratch.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. Yeah, I mean, we did an episode on trust a while ago, which I think we did a pretty decent job of digging into a bunch of this stuff. But just going back to Dan's observations about the difference between operational and bureaucratic military, right? Operational military, you know, there is that trust to fall back on. There's always, like, when in an operational unit, the trust is always built through basic training and sort of ongoing training. And when you're in an operational environment, you have that forcing function that means that things just become flat, because that is the most expedient way to get things done. It's kind of like an energy gradient, right? The environment that you're operating in just does not support, doesn't have enough slack in it to allow multiple different levels, right? You just have to get things done quickly, and that's the forcing function that works when there's a big external constraint. But it doesn't work if it's a bureaucracy and there's a forcing function. Like to Caroline's point, if you've got the CEO who's got an open door, but there's so much shit wrong with your organization that he's constantly getting that door knocked down, right? How is he going to make any kind of sense out of what he's hearing, right? That has to be bubbled up from a kind of fractal structure of your organization, which requires the trust to build that, the ability to aggregate information from the edges of the organization. If you don't have that trust, everything has to go through the CEO's door, and he becomes overwhelmed, or any leader at any level. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's maybe companies or any type of organization, there's a type of mode. There's a few modes. There's the kind of propaganda type of mode where where it's it has to be good news, and we talk about honesty and all these things, but actually there's a particular maybe a type of things that are socially acceptable or not socially acceptable, and another mode where people were able to lead by example and actually maybe show their fallibility or their vulnerability, their ability to listen and learn. And it's almost like, are we looking out then, presumably in a group context, we're looking out for those cues, I'm guessing, to tell us as individuals whether we're in one mode or another?
Well, I think it's down to structures, isn't it? So as a CEO, I'm in an isolated position, and I might have my C-suite colleagues, but ultimately the buck stops with me, and I'm reporting into my board, and that's the reality. I'm also in a position where I'm fairly secure, and so it's quite easy for me to ask for that honesty, that transparency, to want to know what's going on with my organisation. As you get further down those levels, there are severe penalties for that honesty, and it can also be seen as negativity. So red team thinking takes an awful lot from black hat thinking, which is around being really clear about what the risks are, being really clear about identifying what the potential security issues could be. And when you're doing that within the organisation, you're seen as negative and interrupting the flow and not cracking on and not having the right spirit and the right optimism and the right mindset, because you've got people there telling you that actually this can work and it is going to work, and they're selling you the golden goose. And so you kind of find yourself in a really difficult position, both psychologically but also in that career limiting way, around saying, well, actually, I think we've got a problem here and we need to rethink our decision, because then you're up against ego. And so if the sponsor of that program of work doesn't want to backtrack or doesn't want to turn around or doesn't want to accept that there might be an issue, the person highlighting that issue becomes a problem. That problem then becomes impacted in a way that can make them become very negative. So what happens is people that talk within an organisation that get shut down or are not heard will either shout louder, and they'll end up shouting to the wrong audience in the wrong way, or they'll end up going really quiet and just kind of moving along with the organisation. And then you end up with the wrong people in the wrong organisation. That's why organisations fail en masse. And so it's a really important issue for affecting the culture in that way, to make sure that whilst you're asking people to be positive and to bring the right mindset to work, you're also asking them to be able to identify risks in the right way and rewarding people that offer those risks up.
Yeah,
I'm I'm still really absolutely gobsmacked when I talk to some of my peers and colleagues, and you know, and I say, oh, how's it going? You know, how's work? How's everything? And they say, oh yeah, it's going great. It's going great. I log on at 8 o'clock. I log off at 8 o'clock. I'm like, what? They're doing like 12 hours because they're working from home. And the expectation is, yeah, just put those hours in. We're not going to give you any more reward, you know, but we're going to deliver sooner. And thanks for putting in that extra time. But that seems to me like the wrong attitude. You know, people put in their blood and sweat when they know that actually it's for a really good cause. You know, they do that because they can see that actually from a family perspective, from a smaller group, oh shit, if we don't pull together, we're going to lose the roof above our heads. So that kind of, at the moment, with what's happened with COVID and everything, the whole world has stopped. And even though we've had to isolate, it's almost like local communities have had to come together more so.
And that's a really good point, Mandy, because in organisations, what you see as you take people through the change curve is that transparency actually diminishes when you're in a position of societal risk. So the more risk that we're in economically, actually that affects people's appetite for risk taking within the workplace because they don't want to become vulnerable. So for organisations that are doing annual structural rechanges, particularly right now, it becomes much more difficult to engender a culture of trust and transparency because it's about protecting my own backyard. And to go back to the manager that had the view that the Queen should think the world smelt of paint, when I asked him what his motivations were for work, he said, all I care about is putting nappies on my child at home. And as long as I can feed my family and put nappies on my baby, the reality is I'll do whatever it takes and I'll say whatever I need to in order to keep my job. And so when your purpose is not driven by your internal goals, but actually driven by your external goals, the reality is that, again, you've got another filter that says, well, actually, I'm not here to do what's right for the company. I'm here to take a wage from the company to do what's right for home. And that's a very different purpose alignment.
There is a double-edged sword, though, to people kind of stepping up and going above and beyond, and that's that they mask systemic flaws and problems within the organisation. One of the sort of jobs that I finished up on in the military was as an independent safety assurer, and I was overseeing defence procurement, number of fleets of helicopters and people, capable individuals who were going above and beyond, and all that was happening is the output remained as they wanted to achieve, but they were systemically masking problems within procedures, doctrine, policy. And there was a secondary element to it as well. You then set a precedent, and we talked earlier about churn in companies, and even if you're a good company, you're going to expect your workforce to start moving sideways or vertically. That's perfectly normal. But if you start taking on responsibilities over and above the actual core role, you're actually setting whoever is going to come in after you up for a fall, because they either accept it and carry on, or they hold their hand up, put their head above the parapet and say, I'm not prepared to do that, at which point they look like they are actually performing at a lower level than the previous incumbent.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of in the press recently, there's been an interview with Steve Thompson about the rugby player, ex-rugby player, who the age of 42, I think, I've just checked now, the age of 42, he's been diagnosed with early onset dementia, and he can't remember the World Cup that he won in 2003. And what he was explaining in the article I read a few days ago was that when rugby turned professional, they were achieving the results. They weren't really looking at the long-term effects on people's their health and well-being, because it was about achieving the result in front of them, rather than looking at the problem holistically. So what they found is when rugby turned professional, the training rates went up, the impacts were harder, they'd had less days off. It was really, they were pushing people beyond what was sustainable, apparently. but really that only came out afterwards. So it was the same as the working the 12 hours a day. It was a non-sustainable solution.
Yeah. And a lot of those things are just papering over cracks, excuse me, as you said, Daniel. And there was a great podcast recently with Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And they were talking, he was being interviewed, and they were saying, how do these companies stop failing? Why are these transformations not working? What do they need to do? And he said they need to do two things. And he said the first thing is they need to slow down. It's because why are people working these hours? Why are people hitting these deadlines? Because there's such a pressure for speed. And speed's great, but if you don't have the safety, quality, morale with it, then you just go off a cliff much quicker. And he said, if you slow down, you will speed up. It's that old mantra of slow down to speed up. And if you take a day out to plan now, that will save you a month downrange. And if you don't, you'll be 2 months off track. And he said, the second thing you have to do is protect your dissenters. This is because if you treat these dissenters, as Caroline mentioned, these people who are negative, cynical critics, moaning, holding back the positivity, it said then your company will become like that, because they're the people who care. They're the passionate ones. So if you protect them and people see they're protected, you'll grow more of them. And before you know it, you'll have a whole growing force of dissenters who aren't dissenters. They are passionate, caring individuals who've got great ideas, and they've just never been allowed to voice them. Deviants, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd get them all in a room and go, right, who's my deviants? And
Yeah,
they'd all
tell
go,
me how it
"No,
is."
You can't say that.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I can.
Yeah. But there's
they
still
were
a
my
stigma,
favourite
isn't there, with
people.
it? Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. They are. You spot them in a room, you can walk in straight away. Or once the guy knows that you're a good guy or a good gal, they'll come and speak to you after and say, can I have a word? What? I've got this great idea, but no one's ever listened to me. Well, tell me it. Let's make it happen. And that's what companies need. And they have them in their thousands, but they're all sat there behaving like sheep, unfortunately, because they've got nappies to put on the children. They've got mortgages to pay. And it's only a few individuals in a privileged position who can step up and say, I'm going to call this out, whatever the cost, because they can do that, but not many can.
And that's something that, just to kind of plug some of the stuff that Tim and I have been involved in, some of the work that I've been doing around guilds, that's one of the advantages we've seen with guilds, is the people who maybe are thinking differently or dissenting, they can actually have a collective voice, not in a negative way, but in a way that they can actually say, oh, I'm not alone, it's a thing, and therefore how do we solve that particular problem? And what we found is it's tough work. It's not like everything just like suddenly falls into place, but what it means is we're able to turn that dissent into things that are, actionable insight that we can then use to transform the organization. It's hard work, but it does give a route. It's like a lightning rod or a connector to actually turn that emotional energy, which is essentially what it is, into something that's actually a positive transformational force. And so Tim, I know that you've seen some of that in action. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Well, it's been really interesting hearing these excellent thoughts over the last few minutes. I'm sorry I joined late. I was reminded, actually, I think by what Dan and what Marcus were talking about, effectively the importance of building in Slack into organizations. So effectively, without that, if you optimize to 100%, everything becomes rigid, inflexible. There's no opportunity to change. If you recognize that actually there's value, there's human value, there's social value, there's value for the world in leisure time. So you could look at this as almost a truth that's been there since the kind of, as long as human history's been there. If you think about the idea of a Sabbath in kind of dating back a day of rest, like taking out the day of rest doesn't improve productivity. I mean, Stalin tried doing a 10-day week, and the results are devastating. So effectively, we need to think about rest, relaxation. It's in Covey's 7 Habits, isn't it? Sharpen the saw. That unless you take that and if you prioritize that, I mean, they talk about Napoleon as commander-in-chief reserving the planning of the sleep. He said they'll delegate everything else. Logistics can go to somebody else, and and munitions can go to somebody else, and planning the troop movements can somebody else. But he wanted, as commander-in-chief, to control the sleep. You're going to need your sleep just before the battle, and I'll give you your sleep. You hear like in Winston Churchill's early years, you see about the big rest and feast before one of the Boer Wars. So effectively, all the people who know how to get good performance out of large groups of people know that people need their rest, they need their sustenance, and yeah, too few companies actually really think about supporting the whole person. And perhaps in the past there were sort of beneficent employers who would sort of plan workers' cottages alongside the factory, and that sort of social capital isn't really a thing. Capital's become so transactional. It's like we can just hire somebody as a contractor for a temporary period and then let them go, and we'll hire somebody else and let them go. What are organisations doing to build social fabric? Who's spending libraries? And even if you pay like SimCity, you find that you put a library in, and the civilization, the society grows. It's like, where are the organisations that are actually making social capital investments? I'm going to stop ranting.
I think it's more than that as well. It's as if large organisations believe that communication flows through meetings, emails, and telephone calls. I mean, that is not my experience of large organisations. The really useful, good communication, which contributes towards its collective corporate knowledge, happens at the tea bar, a beer after work, walking back from the gym at lunchtime, whatever. That's where the really true, honest, relational communication happens. And if organisations honestly don't believe that there is value in allowing people to interact in that way, then they're cutting their noses off to spite their face.
Yeah, absolutely. I had two previous sort of commanders in the military. One of the guys used to get on his bike in the morning and he'd cycle around the base and stop in at all the tea bars. So the guys who'd been there having the morning coffee, he'd walk in and he's like, "Don't worry, I brought my own tea bag," and he'd go and make himself a brew and he'd just sit there, chat to them all. 3,000 people on this base. And within 6 months of being there, he knew everything that was going on, more than his subordinate commanders did. He knew every person by name, their names of their wives and their children. And the workforce mentality and the culture shift at just that one act, 2 or 3 mornings a week, spending 20 minutes on his bike, just snowballed massively and created in a very short time a culture that would work and die for that man if we had to do. And then the second guy was a guy when we were working in a bunker, and the smokers could go out and have a smoker break. And a new boss arrived, and after about 2 weeks, he started disappearing. And he came and I said, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I've been out to the smoker shed." I was like, "You don't smoke." He goes, "I know, but you should hear what I hear that goes on there." And he was like, everything. That's where, and once they'd accepted him, as one of the guys in the crowd, they just let their tongues fly. And he was hearing everything going on. He could then come back and question it and challenge, and also get the coal-face view of what was wrong with the unit. And he'd come back and go, "Hey, Colonel so-and-so, you're telling me this, but the guys on the front line are telling me this. Why is there a disparity here?" And it's again, it goes back to the humility, and the Japanese call it going to the gemba, getting to where the coal-faced action's at, taking away the 3 feet of oak between you and the real world, and going to where your people are delivering what you expect them to be doing so. And if you don't have the wherewithal to see that that's valuable to both you as a leader, but also inspirational for them, to see that they've got the CEO stood next to them asking them questions and listening, then the power that brings, you can't pay for that. It's insurmountable.
Yeah. And there's actually a couple of, so I've been sitting listening to this and I've been looking at the comments. I think there's a little theme emerging that I just wouldn't mind pulling on for a sec, if you don't mind. So this idea of convergent and divergent thinking is one. Tim's point about sort of circadian rhythms and black is another, and I think they're all kind of a similar theme, right? There's another few questions in the chat about incomplete information. I think one of the problems that we sometimes have in organizations is that everyone's always executing all the time, right? Whereas successful organizations, and I'm thinking of one example would be Basecamp, fairly small team. They're a SaaS, they build a SaaS product, but their organizational rhythm, their organizational tempo is 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off. right? They execute for 4 weeks, they reflect, learn, sort of reconvene for 2 weeks. And I don't see many other businesses doing that, right? A sprint is 2 weeks with a Friday afternoon for an hour to do a bit of retrospective and then straight into another sprint, right? Where's the circadian rhythm and the slack in that? And I think the execution is like an outward flow of energy, right? You try and make your change in the world, but you have to balance that with, okay, what was the effect of that, right? If we think in terms of OODA loops, we've taken some action. Now we need to sit back and see what happened, see what the effect of that action was. And I think the sitting back and the reflecting is where things like red team thinking come in, and dissenters and having those people raise their voices. And where you execute is where you get everyone pushing in the right direction, and you align people. But I don't see many businesses doing a good job of balancing that. What do you all think?
I think to that point, Ben, organizations like Google would separate 20% of the time so that people could create and innovate. And so they could switch off their daily task, and they could actually buy back into the organization and create stuff that would help with the innovation. And that taps into a different side of your brain, a different side of your motivation, and you're incentivized for that. But I also think in terms of driving that risk and reward is that we don't hold accountability. So lots of organizations are not making people accountable for their risks and their failures, and for the people that come in and say it's going to be done in half the time and all of the rest of it. And then that ensues a blame culture. And so the more that I can slip out of taking accountability, the less I'm likely to reflect on what I've done. And so you lose that critical thinking, because all I'm doing is I'm full of ideas and I'm full of execution and delivery. What that delivery looks like and who falls under the bus in order for me to get it is irrelevant if you're not holding me to account.
So I wouldn't mind just building on that, Caroline, also trying to weave in a question from Indigit, who asks, how do you balance amplifying the clear value in the voice of dissenters and people that dissent for possibly less valuable reasons? So this reminds me a little bit of Amazon and their 14 leadership principles. So one thing that I think is interesting, and this also relates to organizational culture. So there's somebody I know on LinkedIn called Dan Eds, who writes about leadership systems over cult of personality as leadership. And I think the challenge with, I think it was either Indigit or somebody else asked another question about how do you tell which mode you're in, and oh no, it was Jeremy. So I think these are related. So the deal is, if the mode is down to the individual, it gets a bit more problematic, doesn't it? You know, it's very much you had your great cycling base commander who reinvigorated the organization, and then you've got somebody who maybe doesn't do that. We're then effectively limited by the individuals and their behaviors and their management styles. Now, what I believe Jeff Bezos does is more aligned to what Dan Eds talks about with leadership systems. So if you look at Amazon's 14 leadership principles, one of them, I can't remember the number, have backbone, disagree, and commit, which is very famous. So how you might amplify those dissenting voices, Indigit, is you actually have it as one of your core operating principles for how a leadership operates. So people actually have an obligation to disagree and commit, to actually dissent, but then to actually knuckle down and do something, even though they say, well, I'm not sure, I don't think this is the right thing to do, but I'm going to commit and help you anyway. And then what that means is that it's changed the game very cleverly, because that's not dependent on Jeff. So if Jeff leaves and somebody else comes in and the disagree and commit still stands, then people will probably still follow the disagree and commit. It also is gaming it very subtly, because it's not just saying, yeah, disagree, it'll be fine. It's saying, well, actually, people sometimes have to do things that they don't agree with. in order for us to work together. But that it's not what they've done is, rather than it being an either or and a zero sum game, it feels like through some subtle linguistics they've turned it into an and an infinite game.
Absolutely. And I think what I've always done with the people that have been decentralisers in my environments is that I've taught them how to bring solutions to the table. So it's absolutely brilliant to bring in your problem. Let's also bring in what you think the solution to that might be, because the reality is most people that bring in the problem already know what the solution is. What they're afraid of is that that solution won't be accepted, it'll be laughed at, it will be undermined. And so we have to teach people how to build on people's ideas rather than just rubbish them because they're not fully formed. And so again, it's this whole organisational approach of really taking them back in terms of what the process looks like for holding that accountability, but also then bringing in that discipline and that commitment. So if I'm going disagreement and commitment, so if I'm going to have the backbone to do it and to disagree, I also have to bring with that some form of solution, or open up the door to a solution for other people, and then commit to whatever action that is and take that away as part of my commitment to that disagreement. And what you're doing is teaching people how to work within the whole organisation. The problem that, it's back to what Ben said earlier, if you exhaust people with problems, the reality is there's only so much they can take and only so much that people can deal with. And then you've got to understand and identify what the agenda is. So what's the motivation for you talking about that disagreement today is really, really important, because quite often you might find that it's just that they don't like that manager, or it's just that I worked with a company once and they couldn't get to the root cause of why their people were falling asleep at the desk, literally falling asleep at the desk, literally going home early, literally lying to customers. And they said it's a whole team and they won't stop doing it and we can't manage it. And it went back to something that had happened 5 years ago around their incentives not being paid. And they felt that it was a broken marriage. They felt that it was loveless. They put all of this effort in. Suddenly their incentives weren't paid. Their titles were changed. Nobody had communicated with them. And even though some of the people in the team hadn't been part of that failure, they'd adopted the failure behaviours of the other people within the culture of the team and become angry for them. And so they then collectively had this response.
Yeah,
so
monkeys in the cage.
Yeah, it's the monkey in the cage. It's the electrocuted
if you don't
bananas.
understand the motivation, you're never going to get to the solution.
Yeah. And that's why if you have the red teaming capability as a internal behavioral thing that you do, and it's adopted and it's supported from the top, then that allows people to bring this capability and the tools and techniques that come with it to do exactly that, Caroline, to allow people to bring problems, to bring solutions, to hash them all out, to break them all apart, to dissect them, to challenge each other's assumptions. But you then get that team capability where even anonymously you can do this, bring it all back together again, and everybody feels that they've had a say. And even if my solution, I walked in there thinking, I've got the best idea, and it gets smashed apart, I don't care. My ego's not bruised because I've understood why. And it goes back to that, if you've not been promoted or whatever, if someone explains to you why and you can see the reasoning and you're engaged and you made part of that conversation, then it doesn't feel such a bitter pill to swallow. But it's when it's all done, secretly or deviously behind your back that people behave like they're in a loveless marriage. And they should.
And also, it begs a question. Sorry, Tim, I'm going to be really quick. I promise.
Go for it.
I promise. Sometimes it also begs a question of strategy. I've seen in organizations where the strategy has been, okay, let's get the weaker, the weaker person up above because they started on a really low salary. We want to raise them. How can we raise them? Even though they're not that good, let's just raise them. And as a consequence of that, you're feeding into this mediocre type of performance. And really, nobody likes to be mediocre. Everybody wants to challenge themselves and be better. So if you've got this organizational thinking of strategy of, no, let's get the weaker person up, or let's get that lowest paid person high up the chain, and they'll make decisions. It doesn't matter if they fail. We want to do... It's that whole thinking around that strategy and the objective. And the people are not stupid. They talk. Everybody talks. And everybody understands. But then you've got people up above making these decisions and glorifying their decisions in a negative way. It's not helpful. It's not useful. Tim, sorry, go on.
It's fine. I'm just reflecting on some of the themes that are sort of underneath the surface here, and I think what you might call the politics of time is an underlying theme. It's like, who controls what people do with the time? And traditionally in working environments, you had clock in, clock out mentality. Nowadays, with remote working, you're going to get companies starting to try and surveil their employees and find out how many keystrokes they're doing, and it's all trying to control time. And really, I suppose what I'd like to sort of throw into this is the counterbalance to the political control of time has to be some kind of rights around time. Now, I know that you've got, in Europe, you've got the limits on the working week. We're about to leave Europe. We know, will that stay in the UK? There have been countries that have, mandated, 4-day weeks, or even less, that are actually politically intervening in the time control. And ultimately, because we've all got limited time on this planet, if you live into your 80s, you get 30,000 days. It's not a lot of time. So you should have quite a bit of time during your life to do things that are worthwhile for human beings. So I'd just like to chip that in. It's like, part of the company ethos, or the corporate ethos, should be to allocate time in a fair and sustainable way. I've got a couple other points, but I'll just leave that time on there for discussion until I chip in with a couple more.
So something I wouldn't mind. Sorry, go on, Mandy.
Wouldn't it be fair to everybody if we had a 4-day working week and more people were working and the wealth was distributed in a fairer way? Wouldn't it be much nicer for families to spend quality time with their children, with their partners, and not think, oh, today's Wednesday, really it's Thursday? Caroline, sorry, just a little
Mandy, he said working week, not school week. The kids still go for 5, so we get a Friday off without the kids.
Yeah. Absolutely.
4 days unless you're a teacher.
Indeed.
I think sorry, go on, Chris.
I was just going to say very quickly, another challenge I've seen is around low levels of literacy around the creative process. So we've talked about, Marcus, you talked about Kahnemans and thinking fast and slow, and I think Dan, you may have mentioned the idea of expansive and reductive thinking earlier. The creative process is one which requires quite a lot of dissent and enormous amounts of attrition. It's we need lots and lots of ideas. Most of them won't actually survive in the real world, but that means we need more of the ideas rather than less of them, so we can increase our probability of actually hitting one. That presumably means that not only do we need dissent, but we need people to be able to feel safe to say things that are, not immediately understood, or they're off the wall, or they may not work, because presumably that's creating creative raw material for then more of a reductive process that can filter them down, whittle them down, actually produce things. I mean, guessing, we're in the era now of the COVID-19 vaccines. Presumably this is how drug companies work. They'll go through these expansive reductive phases, and I'm wondering whether maybe the problem of dissent is also related to the not understanding this ideation process and how fragile it is, and the difference between a good idea and a bad idea is extremely slim, and you can't stop having the bad ideas, because then you'll squash the good ones.
Yeah, I've got a good example of this from the COVID-19 response, actually. So I did a little bit of work on this in the NHS as part of the antibody testing stream that was talked about quite a lot on the news and has gone strangely quiet over the last few weeks. So the antibody, so there was a metric shitload of stuff going on in the NHS and various different government bodies, loads and loads of like different consultancies and people and organizations all running around trying to figure out what the hell to do. And the bit I was working on was the antibody testing, and we ended up with a great little team, service design, product owner, researcher, and we figured out in about 3 days flat that the antibody work stream was not going to be effective. The policy direction, you could either go, is this mass surveillance, i.e. we just want to know what the prevalence of antibodies is in the population, or is this for immunity passports, right? We very quickly figured out that immunity passports was bullshit because, just the nature of coronaviruses meant that antibodies aren't reflective of anything. And, there were multiple people in multiple different agencies who had, PhDs and loads of qualifications saying that. And yet for weeks and weeks, we heard people at the top of the house banging on about this impossible thing. So that's a really good example of try something, get the information, and then kill it. Except the bit that was broken was the bit where the information comes back up and you get somebody at the top who is not an idiot who will actually listen and say, okay, that is a thing that we tried. We're in a complex environment. We tried it. It didn't work. But the way most of our kind of systems are set up, like, if that person who will remain nameless but was fake crying on the news a couple of days ago, he's still going to remain nameless. But if he did have the kind of whatever you want to call it, talent, integrity, whatever, to take that decision, the system that he's working within, i.e. the press and all the other ways that decisions are taken at seemingly in government, he would have been torn down for it. So there's an incentive for him not to understand that actually he needs to take a different course of action.
So I'm just wondering.
That's a really important point in terms of what you're incentivized around in terms of your agenda. Having led innovation programs in large organizations, we became very familiar very early on with very ideation platforms, which enable organizations to collate a vast number of ideas, and then they go through an escalation process. Some ideation platforms will determine good ideas by voting, and some ideation platforms will determine good ideation by value. And what I would say about the number of ideas is that it's a bit back to what Marcus was saying earlier around doing it slowly. So what organizations do, and I've worked for a few of them, what organizations do is that they'll target a generation of ideas, and no idea is a bad idea, whereas in actual fact that's not necessarily true. Whilst I agree with you, Chris, that there's a fine line, what organizations need to do is be able to teach people what the value of an idea is. So when I'm looking within an organizational context, if you're teaching people actually this is how to create value within your ideation, then that can help people to be better targeted in the ideation process, because they are very laborious structures. So whilst if I'm looking, for example, at ideation around something that's tangible to a customer, you've got to be able to first create that idea, but also work within a work stream that enables you to develop it to the point that it either becomes viable or not. And quite often, whilst people are ideating, they're not thinking about value. And so there's lots of different structures in which you can teach that, but it does take a lot of time and cost.
Yeah, there's a number of different angles there. What it makes me think of is, value chains. In terms of people not embracing the negative, people do not understand the value chain is not about their organisation. It's about the economy or the system as a whole. And I see that a lot with companies that are working in cloud, where some of them haven't quite understood that, you know, the game's over, they've won, and they're creating effectively a new, you know, a new Jerusalem, as it were, in the sky, you know, in cloud, and it's like there's no way of competing really, apart from to join them or be good at exploiting their services. And I think people have been slow to understand sometimes when you've got this revolutionary technical change in terms of understanding, you know, what we're talking about with red team, and we're talking about facing up to reality and difficult truths. People are not really understanding what a big deal you know, things like cloud, you know, AI's, you know, creating the same type of waves. It also shows me, and you know, to your point, Ben, about, you know, you're kind of the mystery person who was crying on national TV. Does that mean that we need to wean people onto reality, and therefore wean them off other things? And how do we do that? Do we need like a critical mass of? It's the same, you know. It's and how do we do, if reality is distasteful? Then it comes down to something that Dave Snowden was talking about, or I learned at one of the Cynefin retreats, about the yum and the yuck. It's almost like I get some yum, which is better performance, by embracing the yuck, which is some of the distasteful elements of reality. Well, that's quite disturbing, because I might be challenging my politics, my belief system, my view of self. So it's almost like we can't necessarily expect everybody to fall into this sort of red team mindset. Do we need to trick people into it? Do they need to push? Do we need to change the way you know, our education systems work or something, so people are exposed to these things you know, earlier on? I mean, one of the things, for example, I sometimes do to people is, you know, I'll teach people a little bit of how to use, you know, Sun Tzu or something like that, and show, well, look, it's not just about fighting a war. You know, if you want to give up smoking and take up exercise, then you know, you can use Sun Tzu. It's really just understanding that these ideas are more universal, but we resist the reality still.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think this has to be a critical, to get the effectiveness it needs and the pace with which it needs to happen, and given the context of the environment we're now in, I think it has to happen on critical mass, and that's only going to come through strong leadership. And it's not just in business, as you said, Chris. You know, I'm going into my daughter's school. She's 17, doing economics at A level, and she's been having all sorts of conversations with me and seeing what I'm doing. She's like, "Hey, can you come and give a talk to all the guys at school, because this would be really useful?" And we're working with business schools and colleges, because everybody is a mini scientist when you're born. Everybody's contrarian. Everyone as kids, why, dad, why, mum? You know, but then the system beats that out of you. If you go to school, conform. You go to college, conform. You go to business. And it's only those few dissenters that are left who are still behaving that way. But everyone used to be like that. And it's almost called the Terminator red eye. You go around these companies, and when you start to give people this power, the light comes back on and their fire in the belly starts to glow. And you're like, wow, I can ask this question. I can challenge. And I think if you do that, and if you lead that, one of our clients we worked with last week, and their CEO was on the course with us last night, he saw the book in an airport, read the book. He went into work the next day with 15 copies, and he said, right, C-suite, go away and read this book in the next week. Come back and tell me what you think next Monday, because this is what we're doing. I want my whole organization behaving and thinking like this and challenging me. And I can't do it. If I just say that, they won't do it. But if I get you all to do it, and then you get your leaders to do it below, and you cascade, however big your pyramid is, you cascade that down, then that's how you get the critical mass shift. It takes time, but you have to lead it from the top. It's no good doing it as a small team, because then you become the deviant dissenter group, and they'll get found out and they'll get dismissed, you know, and that doesn't work. So it has to be from the top. It has to be focused and driven and understood and allowed.
Yeah.
I think also, to your point, Chris, is that absolutely reality is important, but also letting go is really important. So the way that we work is not to adopt new experience and to rely on our old experience. And so if our old experience is negative, then that will inform our future viewpoint. Yeah. And so teaching people how to let go and adopt new realities is in part informing them of the reality, But given that realities are constantly changing, it's about creating that openness where they can adopt something that's future state, that's not based on experience, either theirs or someone else's, that they've met at the coffee machine.
I'd just like to chip in here with a second thought, which is really about the topic of ignorance and not knowing. And I think this is helpful for pulling together some of the previous thoughts, because there are many things that we don't know, but in the past have perhaps been not willing to acknowledge that we don't know. I mean, none of us really knows about the future. I think the COVID crisis has been amazing for highlighting what's not known. I mean, you can't see, you can't hear, you can't touch the coronavirus. The leaders are completely devastated by it because it's intangible. It can't be manipulated physically in the way that they're used to being able to manipulate things physically. It's sort of akin to cybersecurity, which again, intangible. It's in the realms of things that people can't see and touch. And I think really just acknowledging ignorance is an important part of being able to innovate. It's an important part of making the case for allocating time to the study the things we don't know. If we're not honest that we don't know, we won't allocate the time to finding things out. But if we're honest about the things that we don't know, and if our leaders are honest about the things they don't know, we can then justify allocating the time to find things out.
I love that.
Humility.
I absolutely love that, Tim, because not many leaders or people will admit that they don't know.
Yeah, vulnerability, humility, lacking in most places.
Well.
Yeah.
Integrity is what we are. The unnamed person who was fake crying on TV. Integrity is the biggest lack. I hear these. Of
course it is. Yeah.
I hear these people every morning when I drop my little one off to school on Radio 4, and she's learning all sorts of new swear words. Each new person comes on and just
radio rage, not road rage.
Yeah, radio, exactly. Yeah, they just behave with an absolute lack of integrity and humility, and that is an absolute barrier for any kind of moving forward or any kind of learning.
And again, it's that whole organisation approach to culture, isn't it? I've watched really senior people go out and get some executive coaching and come in and show their vulnerability. And in the lower levels, whilst everyone's nodding and clapping, actually at the coffee machine, they're saying, "Oh, we think he's broken. He's had his day. He's done now." And what he's not that. What he's doing is trying to open up and role model that vulnerability as per the way that we're taught to be, but the organisation doesn't support that. And I think, I was mentioning in the prep call, this kind of culture of fear, this culture of noise that we get caught up in, our own personal agendas, our own personal coffee machine dialogue that doesn't serve us and doesn't serve the organisation, getting that refocused, in some organisations actually saves lives, certainly saves money, but in reality will save businesses. And I think it's so hard to get that clarity in organisations now, because we need to be able to start from the centre point and move it out. So we talk about top down and bottom up, but actually you're talking about a central system that needs to have a ripple effect across the organisation at the same time, because actually top down to bottom up, if there's a layer of lack of trust within any part of that organisation, you're going to lose. In the same way that strategy never speaks to the front door, it's the same process. We always say, right, let's start with our leaders or let's start at the bottom. Neither one of those approaches works.
Yeah.
I just want to sort of reinforce what I was saying was really largely from reading the works of Robert Proctor, who a few years ago started teaching agnotology, which is the study of ignorance as a field, and it's really when you look into how ignorance arises, very often there are people who are trying to promote uncertainty where there is no need for uncertainty. And so quite a lot, for example, the tobacco industry managed to create uncertainty about whether cigarettes were harmful for about 50 years by funding studies on the pretext that at the end of the day people were going to say, well, maybe yes, maybe not. So effectively they managed to fund research that led to doubt. Now, we don't want to be funding research that leads to doubt. We want to be funding research that leads to knowledge and truth. And effectively, if we don't understand how not all research and not all innovation leads to what we're looking for, we need, we're going to go repeat the patterns of the past. So we really need to understand how ignorance arises and be critically thinking about whether we're following a new path of ignorance, where we're creating new barriers to truth and knowledge. And that's so
Jeremy's just given me an in on a topic that I'm pretty interested in that relates to that. So Jeremy's just building what you said, Tim, has said, I can only be as vulnerable trusting as the least vulnerable trusting person in the room. So this straight away speaks to me about prisoner's dilemma. And many people might understand prisoner's dilemma, but it's a standard model in game theory where we're being held in separate cells, and if I grass you up and you keep quiet, I go free and you take the rap. If we both grass each other up, we go down. If we both keep quiet, we get a light sentence. So the problem is we can optimize our collective behavior or collective score by cooperating, but we can optimize our individual score by defecting. And basically, this seems to be very much a function of relationships and repeat interactions. Because without the relationships and without the repeat interactions, then defect-based strategies tend to be the ones that grow. And the reverse, if people actually have those repeats and relationships. And the good example that was given was the famous ceasefire during the First World War, where they play football for a while. And the point that was made in this particular article, and I'll see if I can find the post, was that it was around the fact that trench warfare was unique because you ended up developing a relationship because you were shooting at the same bloke in the other trench and they were shooting back, and a rapport develops and a relationship. So what that means from a game theory point of view, they're moving from more of a defect to a cooperate strategy. So is part of the problem here that the way our economic systems work, the way our political systems work, there aren't those repeat interactions, and therefore we're actually systemically trending towards a defect win strategy over a corporate win strategy, which is then creating less for everybody.
I think when it comes to knowledge and ignorance, absolutely, it's weighted towards somebody who has a well explained but wrong answer is going to be listened to way more than somebody that says I don't know. So ignorance is a void that we as humans naturally want to fill because we're pattern matching creatures. We always want an answer. And I think, I see consultants use this, they come in with a simple explanation for a complex problem, and people will eat that up every day of the week, even though it never fucking works and never has.
Shiny PDF helps.
Yep, shiny PDF, absolutely. I've seen a few of those in the NHS. And I think that's a really, when you look at that from sort of game theoretic terms, and you replace defect or conform with know or be ignorant, then I think that gives us a bit of a clue about why we tell ourselves lies, because we would rather listen to a lie, a convincing lie, than I don't know and be uncertain.
But that's why you need, going back to Jeremy's point, what we're allowing there is characters and individual traits and behaviors in the room to influence the others, where what you need to do is have an ability to neutralize everybody's character. I don't mean in a bad way, but to neutralize the character and allow diversity of thought. And if you use the tools and techniques, that you can do that through anonymous ways of working, lots of different ways of doing it. But you take away what is one of the major problems in every big business I've worked in, from military to corporate to government, is the egos, the behaviors, the characteristics, whether it's a big ego or it's a quiet mouse. The quiet mouse is a genius, but the kid never speaks up because they're fearful of the other ego in the room or someone else. Whereas if you just flatline that and everyone's got the same ability to voice or write or share secretly, and even when that voice mouse opinion comes out, I don't know, it came from the mouse. And we did this with some military, where a senior general and we had two or three brand new lieutenants in the room, and we spent a whole day planning to get 3 decisions. At the end of the day, they're all up on the wall, and they chose the 3 decisions, and that was it. And the general went, right, stop. Nobody's leaving the room until I know, and no harm, no foul, who came up with these decisions. 3 of them, put your hands up. Who came up with the first one? This young lieutenant put his hand up. It's like, whoa. And he said, okay, who did the next one? Same lieutenant. Yeah, and the kid did all 3 of them. And the general just said, hell, he said, if you'd have come in this morning and I looked out the window and you told me the sky was blue and it was blue, I would not have believed you, son. Because that was his biases towards that individual because of his rank, seniority, behavior. But once you level set that and take away that it's come from that individual until you know afterwards, then you get a whole different ball game, and all these great ideas, good or bad, get surfaced, and people can pay them the due diligence that they deserve.
So that points, Marcus, towards, again, the Daniel Ed's point about a leadership system and the Amazon type
Absolutely.
of thing. Because if it's a system, then the system doesn't have an ego.
Correct.
That's the thing. And also the system survives changes in management.
What's needed sticks
as well. And I know, just to give another Amazon example, the way they do innovation. So first of all, interesting enough, the internal version of their leadership principles is exactly the same. There's an internal version. The external version, there's the 14 that are on the website. The internal version is exactly the same, but at the bottom it says, unless you have a better idea.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to chip in here with a reflection on a life experience which I often forget other people haven't had, which is I worked in Dell when it was growing, hitting the internet. I joined in 1999. There were about kind of a couple of thousand people in the UK, but they'd gone from nothing and they'd gone from 0 to 50 million sales the previous years. Anyway, so I joined at a really interesting time. And what was very interesting about that company at that time, sort of 99 to 2001, was that they had some very good values that were pushed out through the whole company. I don't know if they're still there, but at the time there were effectively guarantees of like equality and equal treatment and flatness that were really rolled out strategically across the world as they went into new markets. They usually went into a country where they were not going to be a market leader. They were going to, chase for a number 2 position. They didn't want to be a market leader because that would push them into competition things. So aiming to get to sort of number 2 in Germany, number 2 in France, number 2 in Spain, and then collectively they could still be number 1 in the world, but by getting to number 2 in lots of markets. And what was really interesting about that period, and it's the only time I've ever experienced it in my life, it was a period where everybody in the company, regardless of level, was subject to the same performance management regime. It was very simple, and it was all based on weekly goals that added up to effectively to 10 goals and because of time out, you probably realize in a quarter everybody needs to have training and they need to have holiday. So effectively, if you do weekly goals, you end up with, and people have time out, you have 10 a quarter, and everybody had basically smart objectives, and they had 3 objectives, and they were smart, and they could include resilience for people who let you down or whatever, but effectively everybody had 3. I remember I was a manager, and one of my weekly goals was that I had to have one-to-ones with all of my 30 direct reports. It was quite flat structure. If I didn't have one-to-ones with my 30 direct reports, I failed my objectives. And there was accountability throughout the organization around these objectives. They were all forward-looking objectives, so they weren't, and they were all quite short. So they're much easier to account for than typical, end-of-year performance goals, which nobody can achieve. They didn't have timesheets. Nobody ever accounted for past time, but everybody accounted for forward time. So everybody did rolling 13-week forecasts of what they were going to be doing for the next 14 weeks. And then they accounted for the variances in their rolling forecasts so that if unexpected things were happening, that became part of the pulse of the organization. Now, I've never worked in any other organization that's done that globally at scale since, but I just thought I'd like to share that as an example of kind of the accountability that you can create in an organization and the equality.
So we've just got probably just over a minute or so left. So just to do a quick wrap. Thanks, Tim. I'm just going to sort of just go round. So Ben, you brought this topic to the table. When does red team thinking? When does it start? When should it start?
I think it should start whenever you're making a deviation from your course. Which, you know, the faster the environment is changing, the faster you should be doing that. So whenever you are integrating new information from outside and making a decision, that is an opportunity to make a better decision, and that's an opportunity to use the tools from red team thinking.
And Dan, from your point of view, do you think that in terms of our organisations that we should be considering them as being on a battle footing?
I don't think so, unless there is a genuine vision and purpose that unites everybody. I think if you don't have that, you probably need to think quite honestly about what is driving your people. And if that's their own career progression, you need to find a way to align them towards more of an organisational stance.
And Mandy, what one change related to more of a kind of an embracing of the real reality would you like to see in organizations? What would have the biggest impact?
I think really what Dan said, it's about the objective, the bigger objective, not the single one person's bonus. I think that's where it fails, because if you have big fat bonuses, the whole kind of mechanism of objective is wrong, because all I'm really thinking about is that big pot of money for myself. So it's got to be distributed, I think. And
Marcus, thank you. Marcus, how do we improve this sort of red team thinking? How do we improve this literacy? Particularly, yeah. Well, not in terms of yeah, not in terms of book, but just in general. Particularly, how do we make people more literate in these kind of inconvenient realities that we're living in?
I go back to I think this is a leadership opportunity for people to embrace the wisdom of the crowd that they have before them. You don't need consultancies to go and ask the questions that you can ask yourself. And I think if people were more honest and stopped hiding behind these comforting lies that the organizations have and walked out to the coalface, and as a leader showed that you have some humility and vulnerability and said, look, we're in a world of pain right now. Everybody is. And I don't know where we're going to be in 3, 6, 12 months or how to survive that. Can we all come together and help? And you look at the organizations that have done that, I think that's a great starting point for anybody. And nobody's going to turn around if you do that and say, oh, he's weak, he shouldn't be our CEO. Because if they are, that shows more of their own character than yours as a leader. And I think if people could take that first step across all sectors and departments, government, private, public, corporate, military, then we'd see a world shift in difference of how we move forward.
And Caroline, from your perspective, who are our role models in this area, and how can we emulate them?
Wow, that's a question, Chris.
Sorry, that's a bit of a tricky one. I think that's almost the question: is who are the role models?
Yeah. Let me think. I'll have to come back next week and answer that question. Who are the role models? I don't know. I don't know. I'm proud to say I don't know the answer to that question, rather than make something up.
Yeah. So that is an I don't know, which is great. Yeah.
Can you answer your own question? Who do you think the role models are?
Nice one.
Yeah, tricky.
Where the problem starts, we're elevating one as a role.
As if my day wasn't hard enough, I've had a marital team lie to start the session, and then a complete pulled a rug question at the end.
Yeah, sorry, that was a little harsh, but it was interesting because it's not clear that the answer's tripped off the tongue, which is an answer in itself, isn't it? This proves that this is not, it's not like the we're not made up of, we're obviously programmed not to do this. So Tim,
can I just add to that? One of the reasons for that is we've talked an awful lot about the benefits of red team thinking. We haven't talked about the risks of red team thinking. And I think that's a really important one to start to look at and start to address, because, back to the holistic organisation point, if the organisation is not ready and you integrate red teams, there is a huge risk that you can create more vulnerability than solving. And I'd like to get into that. And maybe that's why we don't see so many role models at this time, because we're not ready. Or we're not mature enough in that thinking yet.
So actually, I've got,
and actually, Ben, go on.
Ryan Peterson, Flexport. So Ryan Peterson has built a company called Flexport from 2015, I believe he started the company, and it's now nearly 1,000 people in multiple different countries tackling global trade. They're a freight forwarder, and he does it. I mean, I don't know whether he's read team thinking, but he certainly knows lots about the OODA loop, and he knows about evolutionary organizational design. And there's a fantastic video interview that I recommend everyone to watch, where he lays out like exactly how he thinks about building a company. And basically it revolves around, I have not got no idea what the right answer is. I surround myself with people who do, and I let them have at it.
Yeah, that's great. And then, sorry, Tim,
I don't want to just be the last word, but I do think what we've talked about here is openness to acknowledging that we may not have the right answer. We're talking about being open to that possibility, and that's critical thinking. That's red team thinking. That's agnotology, the study of ignorance. I'm now embracing what I don't know in a way that I never did before. I think COVID is helping us to embrace our lack of knowledge. I think it encourages new behaviours to
definitely
to stay close. I mean, it actually goes, we're in the dark, we're in the fog. It even goes back to that Eddie Obeng project management book of years ago, about the fuzzy project, where you're in the dark, you don't know if you're in the top of the mountain, you don't know if there's a cliff edge. When you don't know where you go, you stay close, you communicate, you try things out.
Brilliant. So that's pretty much all we've got time for. So thank you very much for everybody on the panel. So Ben, Dan, Mandy, Tim, Caroline, and Marcus. Thank you very much for staying with us and asking the questions. I suppose my closing thoughts on this are, for what it's worth, is that the world seems to be getting a lot redder. So it's something that I think we're going to be hearing more about. And my view is that presumably there becomes this, rather like Neo, there's this heroic transformation that's maybe in front of us, that if we are able to reach that threshold that maybe we're not quite ready for, then, maybe we end up with more, wiser organizations that are able to embrace this uncertainty and thrive. So that's great. So next week's show is about systems thinking. And that's all we've got time for today. So I've been your host, Chris Patton. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm just going to post actually, before I leave, just the meetup and details. And if anybody's interested in joining our Slack, I'll post that as well. So thank you very much.